There are those who think things should stay the same, but there are those who imagine things differently. They are the iconoclasts, enduring a downpour of resistance from those who say their path is false. For a time, they felt alone in the greater sea of rigid black and white spiritual world. But a new way of love and a new way of freedom is compelling them forward. Hi, my name is David Perez, and for the past decade or so, my Christian faith has been evolving, it's been expanding, it's been opening up. It has shifted away from the current form of literalistic Christianity that's just so prevalent today to a more evolving Christianity. Now, it has been a complex journey for sure, but it's also been absolutely freeing. And you know, I'm not the only one. There is a growing number of people whose Christian spirituality and identity is important to them, but the kind of Christianity that is swirling all around us isn't. So I'm going to talk to those who are rethinking Christianity, those who are reimagining it, and those who are the new reformers.
The purity movement, the people who grew up in it, who grapple with its impacts every day.
As a Christian teenager growing up in the Midwest in the 1990s, Linda Kay Klein got swept up in the emerging purity movement, which advocated strict sexual abstinence until marriage.
It had, in fact, started right around the time that I joined my youth group as a 7th grader. This movement saturated the lives of evangelicals, but that was really just the beginning. It entered into public schools, it entered into grassroots organizations.
Sex is a great thing within marriage, and it's
Our country started to shift the way that we talked about sexuality. The purity movement introduced a purity industry with purity rings and purity pledges and purity balls.
A new ritual aimed at encouraging girls and young women to abstain from sex until marriage.
I am living my life the way that I think should be lived, and that's staying pure. So
they're actually purity rings, and they're promises to ourselves and to God that will stay pure till marriage.
The campaign is called True Love Waits, and it's sponsored by the Baptist Sunday School Board.
Thousands of teenagers are vowing to be something that most teens are not. Virgins until they are married.
Make a commitment to God.
To those I name.
By the time he was a teenager, Harris was becoming a leader among his peers.
I remember going out to Washington, D.C., and there was a huge Christian concert/festival that was taking place, and they placed all of these promise cards on the mall.
Teenagers signed cards pledging their virginity and planted 200,000 of the cards, creating a field of abstinence.
wait till you get married!
Rallies promoting purity were held across the U.S., and Klein, who became enthralled with evangelicalism growing up, still remembers the fervor of one she attended.
We were all like, this is the biggest, best concert we've ever been to. And then there was a motivational speaker who spoke about purity and how important purity was. And in the midst of that, with tears rolling down people's faces, they handed out these contracts. I promise that I will save my purity for my partner. I will not have sex before marriage. I'm making this commitment today, and I will hold to it, for the rest of my life. As a young person, I was confused and wanted so badly to be good and wanted so badly to please God and to be acceptable in my community, with my leaders looking over my shoulder and moreover my peers sitting right next to me signing their contracts. I signed the pledge.
I want to know, how many virgins do we have out there?
Harris's book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye, went on to sell over 1 million copies. And as he and others pushed for purity, another more insidious message took root.
Well, ladies, I believe you also have a unique opportunity to protect the purity of your brothers in the Lord. What I think you probably are not aware of is how difficult it is for a guy to look at a girl with purity in his heart when she is dressed immodestly. You have no idea how difficult it is. You have no idea.
I remember feeling like I was a threat, and I remember feeling like I was a bad person. My sexuality was dangerous. It was something to be feared. The narrative that we've internalized is that pure girls and women protect us all. They ensure, by their proper covering up, by their not taking up too much space, whatever it is, that none of us are going to have sexual thoughts and feelings.
Klein had left evangelicalism by the time she was 21, but she continued to struggle for years afterward.
When I would have any sexual experience with my boyfriend, I would find myself in tears and in a ball in the corner of a bed, crying, my eczema coming out, which it does when I'm stressed, and scratching myself until I bled, and having a deep shame reaction. I could actually be this close to doing something that, if they were right, if the purity movement was right, would make me worthless.
I can feel the stars fall down where we are, where we are.
Well, Linda, I'm so glad that you're joining us today. And you have just written this amazing book, this powerful, this profound, poignant book called Pure. And it really echoes what I've experienced. But I just want to welcome you and thank you for joining us here at Sparrow Day.
I'm happy to be with you.
Good, good, good. Well, let's just dive in and let's a little explanation and then a bit of your story. So, yeah. Linda, whether we call it the purity movement or purity culture, give some words and sentences to what is this? What is the purity movement, the purity culture?
Yeah. Well, I pull those two apart. And the reason I pull them apart is because I feel like purity culture, there are so many purity cultures out there, really, right? I would say a culture that teaches that people are defined by other people's perceptions and judgments around their gender and sexuality as either good or bad, pure or impure, right? Or if you're in another culture, honorable or unhonorable, or yet another culture, worthy or unworthy, right? There's so many different words and languages that are used to represent the same concept, which we use in evangelical culture, the word purity to represent. Are you one of us? Do you get to be one of the lucky ones who gets to be loved, who gets to be good, who gets to have a healthy, partnership, who gets to have a healthy life? Or are you one of the damaged? Are you one of the disgusting? Are you one of the ones who is going to struggle and be an outcast in some way, shape, or form? Or if not an outcast, a sort of second-class citizen within our world, if we let you in, right? If we let you really, really in. If you perform your remorse, if you perform your shame enough that we will allow you to remain, right? So there's so many cultures out there that look at gender and sexuality and define people, by their gender and sexuality, and many of them are religious cultures and some of them are not religious cultures. And I think any of those we could use the word purity culture to represent, right? The purity movement that I refer to in the book is the movement that was born out of the white American evangelical Christian church that started in the late 1980s and particularly the early 1990s. This is a movement that was made possible, I would say, by the fact that American culture and certainly evangelical culture was already a purity culture. We were already, even in secular society, we would say, she's a good girl or she's a bad girl, right? And we weren't talking about volunteerism. We weren't talking about any of those things, right?
Oh, right.
So this was part of our lexicon. This was part of our language already. So here comes, this white American evangelical subculture that is providing an answer to a national and indeed a global, point of fear around the AIDS crisis. And the answer is, we'll just stop young people from having sex. We'll just make sure that nobody has sex until they get married. Of course, that would be a heterosexual, cisgender marriage. We're just not even going to say that. We're just going to, assume you all understand that.
Right.
We'll just stop people from having sex, and then we don't even have to worry about STIs. We don't even have to worry about teen pregnancy. Now, how do we stop people from having sex? Well, because sex is a slippery slope, we're going to need to regulate not only people's choices, but also people's longings, also people's feelings, people's thoughts, people's sexual choices that, are not penis and vagina sex, right? Whether or not somebody inspires sexual thoughts or feelings in someone else because they're wearing the wrong thing or because they're seen as flirting or whatever the case may be. We'll just regulate all of those things, and create a fear and an anxiety around those things, and make a promise that if you just avoid all of those things, then you can enter into a happy heterosexual cisgender marriage.
Yeah.
And you will be able to turn on your sexuality for the first time like a light switch, and everything will be perfect and blissful, and you won't have baggage and you won't have problems, and you will have the happy ever after that, so many of us, imagined we might have when we were growing up. Yeah. And the reality is that this purity movement instead created a whole new type of baggage.
Yes.
Right? Developmentally shaping people in ways that, for many of the people that I'm talking with, they have been struggling with for years, for decades, sometimes for their entire lives, to be able to deconstruct some of these ways that sexuality and shame were paired together, sexuality and fear were paired together, sexuality and anxiety were paired together, and to be able to claim their bodies and their sexuality as something beautiful and something whole, and something that is frankly theirs.
And Linda, you come out of an evangelical culture. I do too. No longer are we in it, but I'm suspect of my own culture, meaning that former culture we had certainly had comments about sexual purity. It had comments about unwanted pregnancies. It had comments about abortion. It had comments about STDs. But do you think that former culture we were part of, did they want us to no longer have sex and be pure because they wanted to save future babies? They wanted, they wanted less STDs. Do you think that was the motive, a more altruistic kind of motive that way?
Yeah. Well, certainly there were a lot of players, right? Evangelicalism is a big population. We're talking about, 20 to 25% of the country. So, and the leaders who were bringing this forward, I'm sure had a multiplicity of motivations. Yeah. I think there certainly are many out there who really did believe that this was the way to keep people safe.
Sure.
I also think that it was advantageous. As I said, we as a country and as a world were scared.
Right.
We wanted to make sure that people weren't going to be dying at the numbers that they were dying because of the AIDS crisis, right? We were looking for answers. And, I think that there are certainly many among this population who saw this as an opportunity to step in to say, we've got these answers that you're searching for, and to insert themselves into positions of political influence, essentially, right?
Yeah.
Highly influential, stepping in at this moment. We started to see money at the federal level for abstinence only before marriage messaging balloon and balloon and balloon and balloon. Much of it, required state matches. So we saw over $2 billion just from the federal level since 1981, let alone all those state matches, all that state money that's coming in. We had groups like True Love Waits lobbying the government to send some of the money in this direction. We had other groups like the Silver Ring thing accepting some of that money in order to bring some of these things to not only religious youth, but public schools. We had a huge shift in public school sexual education, or maybe not shift, but certainly, a heavy dousing, right? We were sort of wondering as a culture, are we going to go abstinence only before marriage? Are we going to go comprehensive sexuality education? Then all this money came in for abstinence only. So we see it in public schools. We see it in grassroots organizations around the country. We see it in international aid for HIV. Suddenly this population that had not so long ago been really, really, really fringe was in the center of influence. So when I say really, really fringe, I think the thing for folks to remember is that evangelicalism as we know it today, right? The evangelicalism that we refer to as evangelicalism, more, the sort of background of it was the new evangelicals, right? The new evangelicals that have since now just been called the evangelicals. New evangelicals came out primarily of fundamentalism. And fundamentalism was all about separating from society. The second coming is coming any minute now, so don't even mess with politics, don't even mess with culture. Let's separate, let's have our own schools, let's have our own amusement parks, let's do our own thing, keep ourselves separate and safe and pure so that when the second coming comes, we're not sullied by the world and we'll go to heaven. The new evangelicals came in and said, what if we do the exact opposite? What if we get into the world, right? And we try to influence the world. So here we are, this great opportunity to have a tremendous amount of influence for a group that's really, really seeking just that.
And I think I was a college student in the 80s and part of a evangelical campus ministry. So as a young student, I heard the whole purity message. And then I became a young minister and campus minister in the 90s, and I was one of the proponents of it. And I have deep personal recovery to do it, just as David, a product of that. And I think my wife, Liz, who's now a therapist, she would also say the same. And then I have deep shame as a minister in the 90s, sitting down with college kids and just transferring the message that was fed to me and transferring the moral, pure lifestyle that I had, in a sense, converted to. Before I was an evangelical Christian, I was a normal teenager, part of sexual discovery, and I received no guilt in that at all. It wasn't until I became part of evangelical doctrine that it happened. So I have my own story. So you're a wonderful cultural, you give wonderful cultural analysis, great cultural exegesis, but you also have a story yourself. You're not just a cultural observer. The purity culture and purity movement is something that affected you as well as a young person, and a young person who had a sincere faith. Can you tell us a little of that impact on you?
My studying, what we would now call the purity movement, all came out of having been raised within it. Of course, as I'm curious actually for you as somebody who was one of the leaders for a period of time. And I appreciate you, by the way, voicing that, because I do hear you about the the shame, and we can talk more about shame in that regard too, because, well, let's go back to that. Let's put a pin in that and come back to it.
Yeah.
But well, now I'm all caught up in that one. So,
Yeah,
I have to go back to what was I saying?
Yeah.
What was the question? Remind me of the question, because now I'm off on the topic of shame in my mind.
It was you give great cultural analysis. But yeah, your story. Yeah. Something impacted you with this.
Yeah. So, well, what I was going to say is, though I never would have called it the purity movement, though I had no idea that there was any kind of movement going on. I just thought, this is right. This is good. I'm learning this because this is, somehow this population that I am a part of has the one, correct understanding of God, right? And correct understanding of what the Bible says, and correct understanding of how God is speaking today. And what God is saying is, quite frankly, that, purity, pure life, by all of these definitions, is the way to live out your Christianity, particularly as a young person and particularly as a young woman. Now we understand that there was something else going on.
Sure.
So what I was going to say was, I'm curious for you as a leader, if you knew there was a movement, but let's come back to that. So for me as a young person, I remember really wrestling with some of these teachings. Like you, I had been a convert, and my years pre-evangelicalism were grade school. So, those years, I just hadn't developed sexual shame, right? And I had learned that women should be strong. In fact, I'll tell you a story. I remember my crush, when I was in 5th grade, my crush of a year and a half asked me out. And I was like, wow, the coolest thing would be for me to say yes to Adam Long. And then I went home, and with his note that said, will you check yes or no? Right. And I went home and I said, but what would be even cooler is to be a strong, independent woman who says no to Adam Long.
Nice.
I went back to school. I checked the no box. I gave it to him, but then he was so sad. So then I apologized the next day, and I wrote him a long letter about how I'd reconsidered and I would be his girlfriend after all, or I would go with him after all. Right. So anyway, so the point is, I like you, didn't have sexual shame. I had curiosities. They felt fine and healthy, and I didn't talk about them with anyone, but I also didn't experience shame around them. I certainly didn't experience shame around being, having a degree of strength and intelligence and so on and so forth. And so I wrestled with these messages when I began to encounter them. And yet they got inside of me even as I wrestled with them. And though I would never have held anyone else to them, I think because they were so complex for me, I did accept them for myself. And I did, over time, begin to have more and more complex feelings about my own confidence, about my own strength, right? I might still stand up for something that I thought was right. But then when I was told that that was wrong for me to stand up, I sat back down. I learned to sit back down. And I learned to experience shame around my sexuality. And ultimately, it became so toxic that that was a major reason of me leaving the church. There were other reasons as well, a lot of which circled around gender and sexuality. Please go ahead. You were going to say something.
When you say it became so toxic, and I would have a story with that too, what was that? What was the toxicness of it? Was it an internal punishment? Was it showing up in your dating life? Was it chiseling away at self-esteem? Was it something internal, or was it also showing up in your external responses to what would be a normal young life?
Yeah, it's a great question. All of the aforementioned, right? In church, I started to be called a stumbling block more often. I started to be coded in very sexual ways. I was sort of constantly, I felt myself constantly being watched, right? Like I was a good girl, but I was in danger of leading people astray nonetheless. And perhaps that was because there was something about me that was wrong, right? So whether it was people saying, you're wearing something that's making someone have these thoughts, or I remember, this is something I haven't told before, but I remember going on a retreat, like a missionary trip, and having roommates who then told me, oh, you were making all these sounds in your sleep, you must have been thinking about XYZ. Like, who knows? I was probably hot, and I was having a bad dream, or whoever, who knows? But I started to be increasingly assessed by the outside world, with side eye, essentially, right? And I think that made me assess myself with side eye, and I started to regulate myself more often. I sort of internalized this anxiety around my sexuality, right? And so yes, then the punishment became internalized. Then the regulation and the failure to regulate, resulting in punishment, became internalized. And it was the internalized stuff that, of course, was the worst. I once had, did you ever do this at retreats? You would have the final night of the youth retreat is always a big healing fest.
Oh yeah. Right.
Oh yeah. And one of the things that we did is, one year they had us approach the altar and confess in our hearts our sins. And then if we had sinned against anyone in the room, we then had a moment of silence where we were supposed to go up to the person and to apologize to them. And I remember one of my peers coming up to me and saying, I want to apologize to you because I've been judging you for the fact that you're so flirtatious with the boys, and with this one boy in particular.
Oh my gosh.
So, all of this assessment, and you learn that you're not safe being who you are.
Yes.
And when I ended up leaving evangelicalism, I thought that I would be free and I could be who I was, right? I could have a friend and not have someone else confess their judgment over the fact that was flirtation when it was, really friendship. I could say something that I thought was right in class, and talk a little longer than I should have, and not beat myself up they must think I'm, so self-important, or whatever all the things were, that ways in which I was breaking the rules of gender and sexual expectation. So, and what I discovered was that internalization had gone so deep that even though I was no longer a part of this community that was externalizing the judgment, now it was in me.
Yeah, right. Is this, in a sense, the damage or the scarring is done? It's happened.
Living in the glow, ain't it all beautiful? It goes on and on, and I never.
Linda, looking back to that time, what was it that our spiritual leaders, our spiritual mentors, the doctrine we were part of, what do you think they ultimately wanted for us, or culture, in making it pure? What was the obsession of that? I was part of a ministry that gave a lot of side seminars. We used to call them meninars and feminars. How weird is that? Talking about everything about side hugs to don't even pray with your girlfriend or the person you're in love with, because there's an intimacy in prayer and this.
Wow.
This. And you kind of talk about the true love waits, but I was a product in college of the whole Josh McDowell movement, which was Why Wait. So Why Wait started in the late 80s, and that's what was dumped on me as a college kid. And then as I became a campus minister. Yeah. So what was it our parents, our evangelical parents, our youth leader, what did they want for us?
Oh, that's such a good question. Gosh, what a great question. I mean, I certainly wouldn't have the answer, but maybe I'll take a stab, right?
Please, yes. Yes.
But I think, for me, and I remember growing up in the church hearing a lot about how the culture had gone astray. There was all of this idealism around the 1950s, when women were back at home, and
post-war,
yeah, right. It was, the sort of white American, white picket fence, apron, 3.5 kids or 2.5 kids, whatever it was, right?
Yeah.
And there was this sort of, a lot of talk about how we needed to get back to when things were simple, right?
Yeah.
So there was a lot going on with this return to simple life, right? A life of not looking at everything, going on outside of that white picket fence, right? Yeah. And in many ways, I think that is what many of our parents wanted for us. They wanted us to never have to see what was really going on in the world, or to not have it impact us, or to not have it touch us, right?
Yeah.
If we can just, keep them naive and pure and separate, and get them into that white picket, fence home, and shut those doors.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. As though that would be some sort of safety, or as though safety for some would magically become safety for all, right?
Yeah.
I hear that language still today, this sort of nostalgia around a time that never existed.
Totally.
Right?
Yes. Yes. And you think of maybe in the 80s, the desire to return to the 50s, which was a reaction of the 60s and 70s, right? Because you had mentioned, that whether it was a religious culture or secular culture, there was a shared American moralism.
Yeah.
And as that shifted in the 60s and 70s, of course, then the 80s religious culture seemingly responded to that. One of the things your book does so well, not only do you tell your story so well, your book has wonderful narratives in it of people's stories, and you've done a great job of changing names to obviously protect people who have chosen to be to expose, and so they remain safe. But you tell these wonderful stories of people. So Linda, in that, now as experiencing this and then talking to so many who have as well, what backfired? What have you discovered happened as you told your story? There's tons of Me Too's, no pun intended, but there's tons of us who said, gosh, that was my experience. What did we experience as you talk to people? What did the purity movement, purity culture, what did it in fact really do to young people?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, I think that the Me Too reference is actually a fair one, because one of the things that I've really discovered is that, sexual violence, we tend to think about in these very stereotypical ways, that where there's a physical violence and there's kicking and screaming and so on and so forth. But even a lot of sexual violence, even physical sexual violence, sometimes we don't see kicking and screaming because survivors, freeze or go into a fawn to save themselves, to protect themselves, or any number of other things. And yet the violation is real. The violation is violence. The removal of choice right? The removal of mattering, of what you want mattering in any way.
Yeah.
And I think that that's important for us to understand when we think about the impacts of purity culture, because purity culture impacts many people in a very similar way to capital T sexual trauma, right?
Yes.
Capital T sexual trauma, like a rape or an assault, will often result in PTSD. There are nightmares, there is an incredible amount of self-blame oftentimes, there is, a lot of these things that I see among people who are raised in purity culture, right? In purity culture, it was people coming out of that, same nightmares, right? Same self-blame in many cases, same, fear to the point where it can even become paranoia, right? Anxiety to the point where it becomes potentially panic attacks, right? And I think that is because the consistent lowercase t trauma of sexual shaming also removes agency from people, removes choice, tells them that they don't matter, right? What you want doesn't matter, who you are doesn't matter, right? Sit back down, right? These kinds of teachings that tell us that we are worthless and have no choice, impact us physiologically in startlingly similar ways to the removal of choice.
And neurologically too,
yeah,
right?
Yeah. So that has been something that was, I think, the most startling for me. When I was coming out of purity culture, when I first left the church and started to try to live my life as a secular person, that's when I started to have the PTSD-like experiences. That's when I started to have the taking pregnancy tests, though I wasn't having sex, right? That's when I started to have my eczema come out when I would consider having sex with my boyfriend, right? All of these types of things. And I really remember being like, something is really wrong with me. And my secular peers had absolutely no idea why I was experiencing what I was experiencing. And there were just no resources. There were no tools. There was no one talking about the existence of the purity movement, let alone how the purity movement could impact you, right?
That's right.
So I, for about 5 years, tried to recover on my own, tried to figure it out. And really, I did a very bad job of it. It's not something that you can do alone. It's certainly not something you can do when you don't even get what's going on, and neither do therapists, and neither do sex educators, and I just felt like I was in a total vacuum, right? Now, 16 years of interviews later, hearing stories like mine, and different from mine, but with very similar themes around shame and fear and anxiety over and over and over and over again. Now I understand what I was going through, right? I understand the way that I had shame and sexuality paired in my mind via this very purposeful shaping of these. I talk in the book about a brain trap, right? A brain trap is when two concepts, or a movement and a concept, or whatever it is, two things become tied in your brain, so that when one happens, inevitably the other one follows. So for example, you think about the Pavlovian response. When the bell rings, the dog salivates, right? These things are paired in the dog's mind. Now, in that case, they're not paired because the dog was born salivating when it heard a bell, right? The dog was trained to salivate when it heard a bell, right? By every time the bell was rung, they were provided some, I think, meat, right? Now, the purity movement did something very, very similar with us. It actually trained us to experience shame in association with sexuality. By every time that sexuality is presented, right, we are given a dose of shame, and that shame can happen via how someone else is talked about, right? And someone else's sexuality is talked about in front of us in a very shaming way, via our own regulation, right? Like I talked about my dream that was regulated by, my roommates, or your clothing being regulated, or whatever it is, right? All of these things happening over and over and over really tie these concepts together, so that later, even if you don't want them to be tied together, you hear that bell and you start to salivate, right?
Yes. Linda, there were a group of young people that were part of this culture that said, okay, and they got the purity rings, they made the purity pledges.
Yeah.
And they, for some story of life, they weren't able to keep it, whatever that means. Then there was another group of people that made these pledges, actually kept it. And then both of these groups found themselves in romantic relationships, whether they were the ones who didn't keep it and whether the ones who did. Talk about then the consequences that both experienced, whether they kept the pledge or not kept the pledge. And I refer back to something you said at the start of this whole idea of now we turn on our sexuality. We're now free to go. And now let's turn it on. But we had these years of whether we kept the pledge or didn't. Talk about the impact and the effects that it's taken its toll on people.
Well, it's interesting because that was one of my first questions that I came to this with, because growing up in the purity movement, you learned that you were going to have a horrible life if you broke the pledge, or whatever you want to say, right?
Right.
So here I was, as somebody who was breaking the pledge, as it were, or attempting to break the pledge, but incapable of actually breaking it due to a tremendous amount of shame. But anyway, who was really actively doing what she wasn't supposed to be doing. And I was having all these experiences. And so a part of me, of course, was asking the question, was the church right? Am I having these experiences because I didn't do what I'm supposed to have done, right? And so as I mentioned, I've been doing interviews for 16 years. And they've been really around the country and around the world. But the first year was the beginning, right? The first year was in my mid-20s. I went back to my hometown and I called up all of the young women in their 20s who I could get a hold of, who had been raised in my youth group. And I interviewed them over the course of a year about what their lives looked like now that they were in their 20s, having grown up within the purity movement. And what was really shocking to me, and one of the big questions that I was coming to that year of interviews with, was, is there going to be a difference between the people who broke the pledge, like me, were tempted to break the pledge, like me, and people who didn't? And what I found was that the shame, the fear, the anxiety was in both groups. Whereas I was taking pregnancy tests, though I wasn't having sex, but I was getting close enough that a part of me was like, that punishment, that promised punishment, it's coming. Meanwhile, my friend who had done everything the way that she was supposed to, had gone to an even more conservative evangelical college than our church, had become a professor at that college, had really gone deep, had gotten married. He had been her, first sexual partner. She was experiencing a very similar amount of shame and fear around her sexual life with her husband. And I remember the day that I was helping her search her home for recording devices, because a part of her was afraid that she was being recorded. That was the moment that I was like,
wow,
we are both having extreme fear, to the point where I knew I wasn't pregnant deep down, but I couldn't keep myself from taking those tests. She knew she wasn't being recorded deep down, but she couldn't keep herself from searching for those recording devices because we were both in such a state of anxious fear that we needed something to be able to sleep at night.
That's right.
Some reassurance that the sky wasn't about to fall.
Yeah.
And we had taken completely different paths. So really that friend was the first friend that opened my eyes to, it didn't matter what choices you made, and then I found more and more people who had kept the pledge and who were having the same experiences. So lots of variation, of course, among the experiences that people had, but what indicated what type of experience you were going to have was not the choices that you had made.
Yes, and I think, and these are my choice of words and not necessarily great. So whether one did it right or whether one did it wrong, and we even know that's not the perspective, but whether one did it right or wrong, they still ended up with the same lump of shame. And I would say, as a minister for the past 25, 30 years, in counseling people, I would say that concurs with my counseling with people. And then, I think my wife and I, being raised in that culture and then being agents in it for a time in the 90s, it would concur with our experience. Linda, the byline to your book, Pure, is a very provocative byline. I mean, it's really, you go, okay, this is what this book is about. And your book is entitled Pure, and then the byline is inside the evangelical movement that shamed a generation of young women and how I broke free. So readers of your book, listeners of interviews with you here and on other places where you have spoken, you've spoken at TED as well. So how did you break free? What does it mean to break free? And though your byline in the book says a group of young women, I know in your savvy, in your experience, this has also affected young men.
Absolutely.
Right, of course. And I know you know that. So how did you break free? And what would you say to women and men that are hearing this going, yes, this is what happened to me. How do I break free?
Well, it's a great question. When I talk to people who aren't familiar with evangelicalism, they, in particular, maybe even more folks, but definitely that population, they always assume that what I mean is break free from evangelicalism, leave evangelicalism. It's not what I mean, right? What I mean is the internal, breaking the internal, I want to use the word bondage, but it feels so evangelical, so I'm hesitant to say it, right? But breaking the way in which I was internally wound up, right? And that was a long process of recovery. And really, the way in which I did it was via these interviews. It was via this process of finding the others, of knowing I'm not alone, of hearing about how other people were experiencing things similar to what I was experiencing, in a way that started to move me away from, I'm damaged, I'm broken, there's just something wrong with me, right? Which is a shame frame, right? Shame is this belief or this fear, I am bad, or people will think I am bad, right? So, so I was still stuck in a shame place when I was alone, right? No one else is experiencing this, so I just must be messed up. And I just must be incapable of ever having a healthy relationship, right? And it was when I started to see all of the other people, and as the years went on, seeing more and more, that it started to become obvious that it couldn't be my sort of fundamental brokenness that was the problem, right? There were too many of us out there who were experiencing these things. And if And if they weren't fundamentally broken, right, then I wasn't fundamentally broken, right? And then, of course, uncovering what had happened that had impacted us and that had shaped us, right? It was understanding that something had happened to me, that I had believed something, right? And that I had lived my life and allowed my thought patterns to be shaped by that belief system, but that it wasn't me, and that I could actually change that if I wanted to, with a lot of hard work and a lot of, struggle, along the way. I could live in alignment with something that felt, life-giving to me, right? And that was made possible by knowing that I wasn't alone.
As we close this, and I want to, you mentioned something this in the book, and I certainly took my notes on it. The purity movement and culture certainly rose out of a spiritual, religious, Christian, and then I like how you use this term, the subculture of evangelicalism. Let's not forget it is part of a subculture. And you talk about, or here's how I want to ask this. Linda, how did some people's faith feed them with guilt? And then some people's faith on the backside of this actually ended up coming around and being the thing that then re-liberated them. Does that make sense?
No.
Totally. I know. I listen to myself go, oh, those are awful questions.
I'm not sure if I understand. Yeah. Say it again.
All right. So the first one, I think we make sense. How did somebody's particular faith perspective, especially evangelical absolutism, meaning once you have a faith that is doctrinally a standard and perfect, and obviously if you fall short in that, if you don't even talk about purity, if you don't have the pure belief and you screw that up, there's shame. But we know in this purity movement, it sent some people out of faith altogether. They said, screw the whole thing. I want nothing to do with it anymore. But some of us reconstructed, or back to the Richard Rohr, some of us managed to rebuild our faith in a different way. And now our faith, or our new perspective of faith, became the healer
yes,
of
got it.
the faith that gave us the guilt.
Yeah.
Did
Absolutely.
I do better? Did I
absolutely.
do better on that?
Yes, I understand. So I mean, you're absolutely right in your assessment, but is the question, why do some people end up here and some people end up there?
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, why do some people end up here and some people, I don't know. But maybe what I will say is that this second group, the group of people who, when they reconstruct a worldview that includes religion or spirituality or God or something, in relationship to that, are an interesting group, because if you actually look on the research on religion and spirituality, you find that religion and spirituality can be both. First of all, religion and spirituality, religion is an extended family, right? So like any other family system, it can be really healing or it can be really hurtful, right? And is usually both. So, what's interesting is that oftentimes you'll see, the hurtful version of religion, this sort of patriarchal, white supremacist, hierarchical in a million different ways, right? Sort of model that has harmed people, can be morphed into this other one that is life-giving, that says you are really actually loved unconditionally, that is really about radical egalitarianism and not about hierarchy, all of those things. And the research shows that that form of religion and spirituality is actually part of a lot of people's recovery from all kinds of things, not just from religious trauma, but from many different forms of trauma. Yeah. I think that's one of the things that throws off people who do helping work, who don't understand that religion can do this or that or both.
That's right.
You know, there are so many therapists who don't touch religion, either because they can only see it as this, or they can only see it as that.
Yeah.
Right.
That's right.
And so if you have a community, if you have a helping professional who doesn't understand that religion can result in horrific trauma, right? Who only has seen it play a really important role in people's recovery from addiction and people's recovery, all kinds of things, right? You know, they're not going to be able to support you and help you in the way that you need to be. But, you know, obviously the opposite can happen as well, right? So I think that population is a really interesting population for people. I think we should do some academic research on that, on people who have shifted from one religious perspective to another, because I think there is some deep understanding of religion that that needs to be developed as a culture for us to be able to help people to heal and to not fall into harmful contexts when they're seeking healing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, you know, so often people go to religion because they're struggling and they're hurting.
That's right.
It matters what form of religion you find yourself in, right? It's not
really matters.
It really matters. It really matters. Yes. And we need to understand that better as a culture and as, you know, people who write and think and talk about these things.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And you used a word earlier, fundamentalism, right? So any fundamentalist, absolutist, whether it's a religious doctrine, whether it's your exercise program, your diet, anything that states a purity, that this is the pure way, and one falls short, it's just a shame creator. And for someone like me who stayed, I certainly abandoned evangelicalism, and for a moment thought I was going to abandon my Christian spirituality. And it took some deep work for me to realize those two things were separate. Mm-hmm. And then my Christian spirituality, and I'm not certainly pronouncing this for everybody, I don't mean that, but for me, it then became part of the healer.
Yep.
But I had to leave a fundamentalism.
Yes.
Well, Linda, I'm glad you wrote this book, because both my wife and I think it was just after Christmas, we kind of devoured it, and we needed it, and we wanted to bring it to Sparrow Day, and I hope more and more people discover the book. And I think specifically what I hope for is parents of young people read this, because we knew there were some good spiritual religious parents that wanted something sincere for their young person, their youth group, college age kid, but were also obtuse in knowing they were creating shame. And you kind of show some of those stories, some of the things parents say to children that do deep, deep damage. So I also hope not only those of us raised in the 90s now read this, but anybody raising a child now will read this book. And you're a great writer. You're a great journalist. So I look forward to your next. I hope you keep writing and keep letting us hear your voice.
Thank you so much. That means a lot to me.
Yeah. So thank you, Linda Kay Klein. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Living in the glow, it's supernatural.